The string quartet had just begun playing the soft, romantic notes of Canon in D, and the scent of white roses filled the air. I took my first step down the aisle, my heart fluttering with a mix of nerves and pure joy. But then, the music seemed to fade into the background as my sister, Olivia, stepped out from her seat in the front row. She didn't look like a proud bridesmaid. She looked like a predator cornering its prey. She moved with a strange, chilling confidence, blocking my path to the altar where my groom was waiting. Before I could ask what she was doing, she pressed a thick, heavy ivory envelope into the center of my bridal bouquet. Her fingers brushed against mine, and they were ice cold. She leaned in close, her breath smelling faintly of peppermint and malice, and whispered into my ear. "Sign over your inheritance after the ceremony today, Abigail, or this entire wedding ends right now. I have enough dirt in this envelope to make sure no one in this room ever looks at you the same way again." My groom stood only 10 feet away, smiling brightly at me, completely unaware that my entire world had just split wide open. "My name is Abigail Turner, and I am 29 years old. For as long as I can remember, I have been the steady one, the person who planned for the future and worked until my fingers were sore. I built my life carefully, brick by brick, earning my degree and securing a stable career in property management. My sister Olivia, on the other hand, spent her life trying to tear down everything I built. She is 2 years older than me, but she has always possessed the emotional maturity of a spoiled toddler. Growing up, if I got a good grade, she would hide my textbooks. If I started dating someone, she would whisper lies to them. It wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was a deep, dark obsession with making sure I never had more than she did. Standing there in my white dress, I realized that this was her ultimate move. She had waited for the moment I was most vulnerable, surrounded by everyone I loved, to try and take the one thing she felt she deserved more than I did. She thought she knew me, but she didn't realize how much I had learned from her years of constant, bitter attacks. Our parents were never the kind of people who spent money on flashy cars or designer clothes. They weren't wealthy celebrities. They were disciplined investors and quiet landlords who believed in the power of compound interest. When they passed away, they left a significant estate behind. However, the way they distributed it was very specific. They left me in total control of 3 fully paid rental townhouses and 2 downtown condos held in a legal trust. This wasn't because I was the favorite child, or because they loved me more. It was because they were practical people who looked at the facts. Olivia had a history that made her a massive financial risk. She had defaulted on 3 different credit cards before she was 25, crashed 2 separate leased cars because she wasn't paying attention, and once borrowed $5,000 from our grandmother by claiming it was for tuition. It wasn't for school. She spent it on a luxury vacation to Bali that she couldn't afford. My parents knew that if they gave her the property, she would lose it within a year. They trusted me to manage the legacy they worked so hard to build. Olivia never accepted the terms of the trust, and her resentment was a fire that never went out. It was always simmering just below the surface of every family gathering we had. At Thanksgiving 2 years ago, she didn't even wait for the turkey to be carved before she demanded that I split it evenly with her, regardless of what the legal documents said. When I told her I had to follow the trust's rules, she spent the rest of the night crying and calling me a thief. At Christmas, she changed her tactic, loudly accusing me of manipulation and claiming I had tricked our parents into signing the papers while they were tired. Even at our cousin's graduation, a day that had nothing to do with us, she cornered me near the buffet table. She didn't ask how I was doing. She asked exactly how much rent I was collecting monthly from the downtown condos. It was never subtle, and it was never kind. Every interaction with her felt like a deposition or a robbery attempt. She felt entitled to the rewards of a life she refused to actually work for herself. I looked down at the ivory envelope she had shoved into my flowers. Inside were printed screenshots and several glossy, edited photos. As I flipped through them quickly, my heart hammered against my ribs. They showed my face clearly, but they were attached to messages and scenarios implying I had been unfaithful to my fiancé. The images were completely fabricated. likely created with high-end editing software to look like real, grainy surveillance footage or private messages. It was a total lie, but in the heat of a wedding day, a lie can do just as much damage as the truth. "I'll airdrop these to everyone in this room right now," Olivia murmured, her eyes darting toward the guests. "And I have the email addresses for your groom's parents. Imagine their faces when they see what kind of woman their son is actually marrying." The ceremony music kept playing, a beautiful melody that now felt like a funeral dirge. The guests were standing up, turning their heads to see why the bride had stopped. My groom looked confused, his smile faltering. The clock was ticking, and Olivia was wearing a look of pure, unchecked triumph. In that moment, something inside me clicked. I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't beg her for mercy. I knew that showing weakness to Olivia was like bleeding in front of a shark. I took a deep breath, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "Give me 5 minutes to process this." She nodded, looking satisfied, thinking she had finally broken me. I turned around and walked back toward the bridal suite, my long train trailing behind me like a defeated flag. But I wasn't defeated. I was thinking. I had spent years managing properties and dealing with difficult tenants and legal contracts. I knew how to handle a crisis, and I knew that panic was the enemy of progress. As I walked, I realized that Olivia's desperation had finally pushed her into a corner she couldn't get out of. She thought she was playing a game of emotions, but she had actually stepped into a world of legalities and evidence. I entered the suite and locked the door, leaning my back against the wood. My hands were steady as I reached into the hidden pocket I had asked the seamstress to sew into my wedding dress. I started thinking back to the events of the previous week. Olivia had been oddly helpful, which should have been my first major warning sign. She had insisted on helping coordinate the arrival of the various vendors, from the florist to the caterers. She even brought her boyfriend, a freelance videographer named Marcus, to help out with some extra shots. I remembered seeing Marcus wandering around the venue with his expensive camera equipment. At the time, I thought he was just being professional, but now I realized he was doing reconnaissance. He kept filming what he called venue shots, but I noticed that sometimes the lens lingered on me for far too long. He wasn't capturing the beauty of the gardens. He was studying my movements and the layout of the private rooms. Olivia was always nearby, whispering to him and pointing toward my personal belongings. They weren't there to celebrate my union. They were there to build a trap. They had been planning this blackmail for months, waiting for the one day where the pressure would be too high for me to say no. They underestimated my memory. 3 days before the wedding, I had walked into my hotel suite and found Olivia standing near the desk. She claimed she was just looking for bobby pins, but I noticed immediately that my document folder was open. That folder contained copies of the trust documents and my financial statements. When I caught her, she just laughed it off with a wave of her hand, as if I were being paranoid. I didn't laugh. I knew Olivia, and I knew she didn't care about hair accessories. That was the moment I realized she was looking for a way to break the trust. I didn't confront her then, because I didn't want to ruin the week, but I also didn't ignore it. I realized then that my sister was no longer just a nuisance. She was a threat to my security. I had spent my life being the nice sister, the one who smoothed things over and forgave her outbursts. But looking at my opened folder, I knew that being nice was no longer an option. I needed to be prepared for whatever she was going to throw at me next. That same night, I called our family attorney, Mr. Henderson. I didn't call him in a state of panic. I called him in a state of preparation. I told him about Olivia snooping through my legal documents and expressed my concerns about her erratic behavior. Mr. Henderson had known our family for decades and was well aware of Olivia's history. He didn't seem surprised, but he was very serious. He advised me to keep copies of everything and to avoid any direct confrontation that could be used against me later. "Documentation is your best friend, Abigail," he had told me over the phone. Following his advice, I did one more thing that felt a bit extreme at the time. I quietly contacted the venue coordinator and asked for her additional security presence during the ceremony. I told her it was for crowd control, and to ensure that no uninvited guests caused a scene. The coordinator was a professional and didn't question my request. Because of that phone call, 2 plainclothes security guards were currently standing at the back of the chapel, watching everything. I wasn't just a bride, I was a woman with a defense plan. When Olivia confronted me at the altar, she made one massive, arrogant mistake. She thought I was alone and defenseless in that moment. She thought the pressure of the wedding and the presence of the guests would make me weak and easy to manipulate. She didn't realize that I had lived my entire life anticipating her moves. As I stood in the bridal suite now, I looked down at my phone. It had been recording from the very moment she stepped out to block my path. I had activated the voice memo app the second I saw her move toward me, tucked securely in my bouquet. I played back the recording, and her voice came through with terrifying clarity. Every word of her threat, every mention of the inheritance, and the specific details of her blackmail were all there. I had her confession on digital tape. She hadn't just tried to ruin my wedding, she had committed a crime. This wasn't just a case of sisterly jealousy anymore. This was criminal extortion, and I had the evidence to prove it. I sat on the edge of the velvet chair in the bridal suite, replaying the audio one more time. My hands were perfectly steady. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. For years, Olivia had used my fear of a scene to get what she wanted. She relied on the fact that I was the good girl who would rather suffer in silence than cause a public disturbance. But she had finally pushed me too far. By bringing her greed into my wedding day, she had stripped away any loyalty I felt toward her. This was no longer about family, it was about protecting myself from a predator. Extortion is a serious felony, and she had just handed me the keys to her own downfall. I realized that if I signed those papers, she would never stop. She would bleed me dry until there was nothing left of our parents' legacy. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who was about to take control of the narrative. I stood up, straightened my veil, and prepared to go back out there. I walked back down the aisle, but this time I wasn't walking toward a groom in a daze. I was walking with a purpose. The room was buzzing with whispers, and my groom, Mark, looked ready to jump over the pews to get to me. I signaled to him to stay put. I didn't go back to my spot beside him immediately. Instead, I walked straight to the podium where the officiant stood. I reached out and took the microphone from the startled minister's hand. The room fell into a deathly silence. I could see Olivia in the front row, her face pale but her eyes still sparkling, with a twisted kind of hope. She probably thought I was about to announce that the wedding was off, or that I was going to give her what she wanted. I looked out at the sea of faces, our friends, our family, and Mark's parents. "Before we continue with the vows," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the speakers, "I need to address something very important that just happened." I pulled my phone out and signaled to the AV technician at the back of the hall. We had practiced the setup for a slideshow later, so he knew exactly how to patch my audio into the house system. I pressed play on the recording. Olivia's voice filled the reception hall, sounding harsh and demanding over the high-quality speakers. "Sign over your inheritance after the ceremony, or this wedding ends right now," her voice boomed. Then the recording continued to the part where she threatened to airdrop the fake photos. I watched the faces of our guests as they listened. The shock was instantaneous. Gasps erupted from the pews. Mark's parents looked absolutely horrified, their eyes darting from to Olivia. Mark himself stepped up to my side, his face hardening into a mask of cold anger. He reached out and took my hand, squeezing it firmly. He didn't need an explanation, he heard the truth loud and clear. Olivia's face went from smug triumph to a ghostly, sickly white in a matter of seconds. For a moment, Olivia tried to maintain her composure. She stood up, laughing nervously, and looked around at the guests as if they were all sharing a joke. "It's edited," she shouted, her voice cracking. "She's lying, that's not what I said." I didn't argue with her. I simply walked over to the venue's AV tech and handed him my phone. He was a professional who knew his equipment. He connected the phone to the main soundboard and projected the audio software's waveform onto the giant LED screen we had set up for the reception photos. The waveform displayed live on the screen, showing a continuous, unbroken stream of sound. It was time-stamped, showing it had been recorded just minutes ago. Anyone with even a basic understanding of technology could see it was a raw, unedited file. The proof was undeniable. The room shifted from confusion to collective outrage. My sister's lies were being dismantled in front of every person who mattered to her. She was no longer the victim of a mean sister. She was a recorded criminal. Seeing her plan crumble in such a public and definitive way caused Olivia to finally snap. She lost all pretense of being the concerned sister. She lunged toward me on the altar, her face contorted with a mask of pure rage, her hands reaching out as if to grab my throat or the microphone. But she never reached me. The two plainclothes security guards I had hired stepped out from the shadows of the pillars. They intercepted her mid-step, their movements quick and practiced. One of them caught her arms and held her back, while the other stood between her and me. The guests were now standing, whispering loudly and pulling out their own phones to record the chaos. The sacred atmosphere of the wedding was gone, replaced by the tension of a crime scene. I heard someone in the back shout that they had already called 911. Olivia began screaming, a high-pitched, incoherent sound of frustration and fury. She was struggling against the guards, but they held her firmly. I stood there, calm and composed, watching the sister who had bullied me for decades finally lose her grip on everything. The police arrived within 10 minutes, the blue and red lights flashing against the stained glass windows of the chapel. When the officers entered, I didn't scream or exaggerate what had happened. I walked down to meet them, still in my wedding dress, and calmly explained the situation. I showed them the ivory envelope Olivia had given me, filled with the fraudulent edited photos and the demands for the inheritance. I also provided them with the original recording on my phone. Olivia was still being held by security, shouting at the top of her lungs that I was destroying the family and that I was the one who was crazy. One of the officers, a stern-looking man who had seen it all, looked over the evidence and then looked at her. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "threatening financial coercion and extortion is a felony in this state." The sound of the metallic click as the handcuffs snapped around her wrists was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. She was led out of the chapel in front of everyone, her head finally hanging in shame as the reality of her situation set in. After Olivia was escorted out and the police cars drove away, a heavy silence settled over the room. The guests were looking at me, unsure of what to do next. My bouquet was ruined, and my veil was slightly crooked, but I felt more powerful than I ever had. Mark walked over to me and took both of my hands in his. He looked into my eyes, searching for any sign of a breakdown. "Do you still want to do this today, Abby?" he asked softly. "We can stop, we can go home. We can do this another time." I looked around at the guests, many of whom were our closest friends and family members who had supported us for years. I saw the love and the concern in their eyes. Then I looked at Mark, the man who had stood by me while I exposed my own sister's crimes. "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "I'm not letting her take this day from us, too." We gathered ourselves, and 40 minutes later, we resumed the ceremony. It wasn't the wedding I had envisioned, but it was honest. We got married with a sense of triumph that made the vows feel even more sacred. I thought that the arrest at the wedding would be the end of the drama, but Olivia wasn't finished. 2 days after the wedding, while Mark and I were supposed to be starting our honeymoon, I received a notification from a process server. Olivia had filed a civil complaint against me, claiming intentional infliction of emotional distress and defamation. She was trying to use the legal system to intimidate me, hoping I would drop the criminal extortion charges in exchange for her dropping her lawsuit. It was a classic bully tactic, blaming the victim for the consequences of the bully's own actions. She even went on social media, posting vague messages about family betrayals and how money changes people. I didn't respond to her publicly. I didn't engage in a back and forth on the internet. I simply handed the papers to Mr. Henderson. "Don't worry, Abigail," he said with a grim smile. "We have more than enough evidence to shut this down. She's just digging a deeper hole for herself." The turning point in the legal battle came from an unexpected source. Marcus, Olivia's boyfriend and the videographer, panicked when he realized he could be charged as an accomplice to extortion and fraud. He sent my lawyer a frantic message asking if his cooperation would help his legal situation. He was a coward, and like most cowards, he was quick to save himself when things got real. He admitted that he had helped Olivia fabricate the screenshots and edit the photos to make them look like I was being unfaithful. He didn't just confess, he handed over everything. He gave my lawyer the original editing files, which included the timestamps of when the photos were created, the layer history showing how my face was cropped onto someone else's body, and the metadata that proved exactly where and when the files were modified. It was the smoking gun we needed. With Marcus's testimony and the digital trail, Olivia's civil lawsuit was dead in the water, and the criminal case against her became ironclad. It was game over for her schemes. As the investigation into Olivia's finances continued during the discovery phase of the lawsuit, something even worse was revealed. It turned out that Olivia's desperation wasn't just about jealousy, it was about massive, hidden debt. She had taken out a high-interest personal loan from a private lender several months prior. On the application, she had claimed that she expected a shared inheritance asset worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to be liquidated soon. She had already promised lenders money that wasn't hers to give, using our parents' legacy as collateral for her own reckless spending. She was essentially running a one-person Ponzi scheme, counting on the fact that she could bully me into giving her the condos to pay off her debts. The motive for her behavior was now fully documented and presented to the court. It wasn't just a sister having a moment of madness. It was a calculated attempt at fraud and theft, driven by financial ruin. Seeing it all laid out in black and white made me realize just how dangerous she had become. When the day finally came for her criminal trial, Olivia tried one last performance. She walked into the courtroom dressed in a conservative outfit, her eyes red and puffy, as if she had been crying for days. When she took the stand, she claimed she was under extreme financial stress and that she hadn't meant any harm. She tried to paint herself as a desperate woman who just wanted her fair share. However, the prosecutor was ready for her. He didn't argue with her emotions, he simply played the altar recording again. There is something incredibly chilling about hearing your own voice in a quiet courtroom, hearing yourself threaten to ruin your sister's life for a piece of property. It strips away all the excuses and the performances. As her words filled the room, Olivia's grieving sister act collapsed. The judge looked at her with pure disdain. The evidence of the fabricated photos, Marcus' testimony, and the hidden loan applications created a mountain of proof that no amount of crying could hide. She sat there, silent at last, as the prosecutor finished his closing argument. The verdict was delivered quickly. Olivia was convicted of attempted extortion and fraud conspiracy. The judge, noting the premeditated nature of her actions and the fact that she had tried to ruin a sacred family event, was not inclined to be lenient. He denied her request for probation, citing her lack of genuine remorse and the severity of her threats. She was sentenced to 18 months in state custody, followed by a lengthy period of supervised release. The court also required her to pay full restitution for the legal fees I had incurred and the costs associated with the security I had to hire. Her fiancé, who had been standing by her until the evidence of the fabricated photos came out, left her the same week the verdict was read. He realized, like everyone else, that Olivia was a person who would burn down everything around her just to get what she wanted. She was left with nothing, no inheritance, no fiancé, and no freedom. The justice system had done what I couldn't do alone. It held her accountable for her actions. Just when I thought I finally had closure, I received a final legal notice. Olivia, even from behind bars, had tried one last desperate move. She attempted to contest the validity of the trust itself in probate court. She claimed our parents weren't of sound mind when they signed it. However, my parents were smarter than she gave them credit for. They had included a strict no-contest clause in the trust documents. This clause stated that if any beneficiary challenged the distribution of the assets, they would immediately forfeit any and all interests in the estate. By filing that challenge, Olivia triggered an automatic forfeiture, of any discretionary family assets she might have received in the future, including smaller personal items or future dividends from the family's remaining investments. Her final attempt to steal from me ended up costing her the very last scrap of the family legacy she was so obsessed with. She had literally gambled away everything she had left on a lie, and she lost. It was the final, definitive end to her years of harassment. 24. 6 months after the trial ended, life began to settle into a new, beautiful rhythm. With the legal battles behind me and Olivia in custody, I was finally able to focus on the properties my parents had left me. I decided to take a strategic step forward. I refinanced 2 of the rental townhouses, taking advantage of the equity that had built up over the years. I used that capital to expand our holdings, purchasing a 4th townhouse complex in an up-and-coming neighborhood. My rental portfolio doubled in value within a year, and for the first time, I wasn't managing it out of a sense of obligation or fear. I was doing it for my own future, and the future I was building with Mark. I did it peacefully, legally, and strategically. I realized that the best revenge wasn't just seeing Olivia in handcuffs, it was living the life she tried to steal from me. I was successful, I was happy, and I was free from the shadow of her jealousy. My parents' legacy was safe, and it was growing stronger every day. Last night, Mark and I stood on the balcony of our new home, overlooking the city lights. He wrapped his arms around me, and I felt a deep sense of security that I hadn't known for a long time. There was no chaos, no hidden threats, and no looming court dates. There was just calm. Our wedding photos had arrived the day before, and as I flipped through them, I noticed something. In every single photo, even the ones taken after the police arrived, I was smiling. It wasn't because my sister had been arrested, it was because I had refused to be cornered. I had stood up for myself, used the law as my shield, and protected the people I loved. Olivia tried to steal my inheritance on my wedding day, and it ended in handcuffs for her. But for me, it was the beginning of the strongest, most authentic chapter of my life. I had turned a moment of betrayal into a foundation of strength. I looked out at the city and realized that, while you can't choose your family, you can certainly choose how you let them treat you. I chose peace.